this morning. We know there are folks from all over joining us. So what we've asked you to do is introduce yourself in the chat box, and I'm really happy to see so many people have already done so. We've asked people to share their name, their pronouns, and where you're joining from. So my name is Chel Miller. I use they, them pronouns, and I work for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I'm located in so-called Albany, New York, on unceded and occupied Mohican and Haudenosaunee land. I'm also joined by, there are some other NYSCASA staff here. Now Alyssa's here, and I see Artisa. I'm not sure I see anyone else's names in the participants list yet, but keep your introductions coming. I'm so glad you could join us. So I'm going to start with some logistics. If you have any technology problems, if you're not able to hear audio or see the screen that I'm sharing, you should be seeing a PowerPoint slide. You can enter any issues into the chat box or email me at cmiller@nyscasa.org. If you have content questions, please enter those into the Q&A box. You can also email me at cmiller@nyscasa.org. If you have trouble accessing the Q&A box, you can also use the chat box. I see that most of you have been able to access that so far. I'm excited to see some names that I recognize, people I know, and also a lot of new names. So it's really exciting. We are recording this and we'll be able to share it with you later, as well as whatever resources that we talk about and additional resources that come up. So our agenda today is to give you a little bit of context to this webinar and why we're doing it. We're going to do an introduction to restorative justice, and then we're going to watch a recording of a webinar that we previously hosted with Sujatha Baliga at Impact Justice. And then we'll take some time to reflect on what we've learned, what we've heard through a facilitated discussion and Q&A. Yeah, keep these introductions coming. I'm so glad to see all of you here. So for context, this webinar is part of our virtual training series called Ending Violence Without Violence. We had originally envisioned this series to be lead-up programming to a conference that we had planned to host in June 2020, but because of the pandemic, we were not able to host it. So this is going to be a series that kind of replaces that. Over the next several months, we'll be hosting webinars and other online training opportunities to dive into the principles of restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, and other non-carceral approaches to violence prevention and response. In other words, approaches that don't rely on the criminal legal system. The series will underscore the importance of building communities that can prevent sexual violence, respond to harm, and heal trauma. We've hosted webinars earlier this year, focusing on, just introductions to community-based approaches to violence prevention and response. So we'd hosted a webinar in January that really launched the series. And then we hosted this webinar on restorative justice and sexual violence in February. So part of what you're going to see today is a recording from that webinar. So if you joined us in February, some of this will be repeated. And we're happy to be able to offer this recording again. So there are additional resources and recordings from previous webinars on a website we created called endviolence2020.com. There you'll be able to see some of the resources we've pulled together, as well as recordings from previous webinars. The recording for this webinar will also be hosted there. So if you hear, we wanted to make sure we talked about this context so that if you hear in the recording mentions of a conference that is not currently happening, you haven't misheard something. We were originally planning a conference and that conference is not happening. But we are thrilled to be able to offer virtual alternatives to the conference, and we'll share more information about upcoming webinars soon. So we're just going to dive right in to what restorative justice is and where it comes from, what it can be. So the definition that we're working with is that restorative justice is a model of justice that brings those who have experienced harm, those who have harmed, and affected families and communities into processes that repair the harm and rebuild relationships where possible and where appropriate. There are both Indigenous and Western roots to restorative justice. Restorative justice in the United States can be traced back to Indigenous origins. And although examples of what many have termed restorative justice among First Nations communities in Canada have been well documented, less has been written about equivalents in the US. And there are practices that have been well practiced across the world that may not be called restorative justice, but we can see it. We can see a lineage there. And a lot of the sources that we're working with are the Impact Justice Restorative Justice Project. That's actually my primary resource for this webinar. That they can be found at impactjustice.org. So under our current criminal legal system, which is the dominant paradigm that many of us are working with, punitive justice asks, what law was broken? Who broke the law? And how should they be punished? In contrast, restorative justice asks three very different questions. First, who was harmed? What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? Restorative justice also asks who has a stake in the situation? What are the causes of the harm? And what's the appropriate process to follow? RJ can look like many different things. One of the most common factors is that in any restorative justice process, survivors define their own needs rather than remaining at the mercy of a court's legitimation or whatever the law specifies. Restorative justice processes can take several forms, including peacemaking circles and conferencing models. Many of you may have already heard of or encountered victim offender dialogues. That's one of the most common that we see in American courts. The restorative justice processes have been successfully used to resolve many kinds of wrongdoing or conflict, including robbery, burglary, assault, and murder. One of the things to remember is, to go back to these questions, is to think about who has a stake in the situation and what's the appropriate process. So different processes may be appropriate for different cases. At its best, Sujatha Baliga says, restorative justice produces consensus-based plans through face-to-face dialogue that meets the needs of everyone impacted, beginning with the crime survivor. Sujatha Baliga continues that survivors often state that simply being asked questions like, how do you define harm? What do you need now? What will make this right? Is the most important part of the process because it allows them to reconnect with their power after experiencing trauma that made them feel powerless. These statements are pulled from the Vokes article that we had shared. And yes, I see in the chat, Alyssa, would you be able to pull the link to the Vokes article? It was in the registration that we had shared with folks. Thank you. So yeah, these quotes are pulled from an article that Sujatha Baliga wrote, published a couple of years ago, exploring what restorative justice can look like in cases of sexual assault. And that'll be shared in the chat. Many of you also already received that in your email, and we'll be sure to share it again later.
Sort of also felt this deep conflict.
You should also have audio now.
I wasn't interested in what was on offer and what was growing at that time in the connection between Violence Against Women Act, all of these things that were really making criminalization the primary response, and separation, shelters. And as I say this, I want it to be really clear that I am in no way intending to devalue the incredible work that advocates do in the current system as it operates. I see that there is need for these things. I think we need to reimagine how they might be more beneficial. And I think that they are under-resourced even to do what they set out to do in a way that could be beneficial at the scale that is needed, given the ubiquity of harms like child sexual abuse and domestic violence and rape and all forms of sexual violence. So from my side, it never occurred to me to contact the system because I didn't want my father to be locked up or taken away. I didn't want the involvement of Child Protective Services. I was growing up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania where, we were the only people, only immigrants. I was the only child of color in my school. I didn't want to be put in a home where nobody spoke my language or ate our food or practiced our religion, and I didn't want to be taken away from my mother and my sister, who was my lifeline, my best friend, and my true advocate, as much as was possible under the circumstances that we were in. And so to my mind, really, it's interesting looking back and seeing that when I moved into the realm of working to end sexual and intimate partner violence in my early 20s, I started to move towards advocating for things that I myself never chose to participate in, or had they been on offer when I was younger, I wouldn't have opted for them, right? So I started to look to my own religious and spiritual roots, and became interested in the Tibetan system of justice prior to Chinese occupation. And I learned a lot about alternative ways, or I shouldn't call it alternative, ways that people do things that made a lot more sense to me. And in that process, I learned about this concept of Indra's net. So Indra's net, this is an old depiction of it. In the next slide, I'll show you sort of a new artist's rendering of it. But the idea of Indra's net is that the universe is a infinite interconnected web. And a multidimensional interconnected web. And at every juncture, at every single place where two strands meet, there is a gemstone. And that gemstone is infinitely faceted. This is the nature of the universe. And each facet of the stone is reflect in each stone, every other stone in this infinite web is reflected, because each stone has an infinite number of facets. So I don't know if that's easy to see or understand. It's challenging in these ancient two-dimensional depictions and drawings. But what is so beautiful to me about this one in particular, and I want to learn more about it, is that it's got this thing in the middle that has 4 quadrants that look very much like indigenous medicine wheels that I've also been learning more about. So I'm very curious about the connection of this these 4 pieces, and learning what its relationship is really to this infinite web. When I think about things today that we're learning more about through the environmental movement, right? That there is a way that we can throw, for example, a plastic bottle, right? Nothing is truly trash. It's going to end up in our landfills and then in our water, in our particulate matter in our air, it's going to end up in our oceans. And I feel the same way about the criminal legal system. We can't send people away. They are coming home. And regardless, particularly around sexual violence, and I know that many people on this webinar know this, that we're simply relocating it inside, right? Given the high rates of sexual violence inside facilities. In a sense, in the same way that plastic becomes particulate matter in our water and our air, we're still breathing each other's stories. We can't send anyone away. And I feel this really on a deep, deep level. And I think that that's ultimately what draws me to restorative justice as a potential way to heal these harms. This is the digitally recreated notion of Indra's net, where there's this sense, this effort, I think, to have every single, for folks on the phone, I'm just showing these images, to have every single thing in the universe reflected back in every single other thing in this infinite web. I find this image quite moving. And so that's a heavy burden in a sense for us to carry, right? If I am reflecting everything, sometimes that makes me also want to run far, far, far away. And so for those of us who do work in restorative justice, and while we were watching all those words scroll by earlier, I think it's really, really important to center our own wellness and our own self-care. I think people are using better words for that now. That there's something almost to, self-care, a beautiful word, self and care, and yet there's some way in which even that, there's a way that we could frame it that's deeply interconnected, and that the individualism of that can be eroded because we're not individuals in that sense. And so, and that how well we are attending to ourselves impacts the work, and definitely impacts our work as restorative justice facilitators. So a little bit more about honoring the roots of where these things come from. I think it's incredibly important to note that nobody owns restorative justice, right? It is not something that any one person came up with. While Howard Zehr is sort of often credited with coming up with these words, and I think he's done a beautiful job of helping define what these terms are in ways that the secular Western mind can grab a hold of. There are also many, many other teachers, and my teachers sort of in order start with Tibetan and Mennonite teachers, but I've learned so much from Dene, the Navajo people, Maori teachers and practitioners in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, and many, many others, right? So if you look far enough, again, I already said this, but if you look far enough back in all of our roots, we will see the roots of restorative justice there, this notion of making efforts to make amends being a really important part of things, having community and family support for those directly impacted to move to a state of moving forward in a good way. So because many of these things come from indigenous or other faith or spiritual backgrounds, I think it's really, really important to avoid appropriation, right? And so one of the ways that we can do that is to, as we learn different types of peacemaking, et cetera, family group conferencing, things that come from other people in other ways than our own faith and historical journeys, and especially important for us to feel like we can receive these things from others, particularly for those of us who are dissociated from our own historical roots, right? I mean, it is an incredible privilege to know things about where we come from, as encumbered as those things may be for some of us. And so this process of receiving permission and understanding what it is that when we learn things before we go out and do them or teach them or share them, and understanding that that is sort of the first step towards avoiding appropriation feels very, very important. And we didn't say at the beginning, and I just want to say too that there's going to be time for question and answer at the end. So just, I know I'm saying a lot of things and they have a lot of juicy content in them. And so I just want to name that there will surely be time for Q&A at the end. So another thing that I think is really important to understand in restorative justice processes, there's something quite unique about the models that I have been trained in and the approaches that I've been trained in. And it's that we don't do sort of team approaches. Rather, a single set of co-facilitators work with everyone impacted, the person harmed, the person who's responsible, with the community members, and that we are not playing shuttle mediator And we're not the deciders or the decision makers in any way as the facilitators or circle keepers of these processes, but rather our work is to create a safe container for people who've been harmed, people who are responsible, and the community to come together to answer those questions. Who's been harmed? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to meet those needs? What's the process that we're going to do this? You know, who has a stake? What are the causes? All of these things get created by this group collectively with the assistance of the person holding space. So rather than, you know, so what I learned in law school and people who do mediation, right, is that we're neutral arbiters or neutral mediators. And to be clear, there is no part of my heart that is ever neutral, especially in the more severe harms that I think about and have the honor of occasionally holding processes for. And that rather that my orientation is equal partiality. And that really ties back beautifully to that quote by Dr. King, right? Like, I can never be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. I am invested in you being who you ought to be. I am partial to you being who you are meant to be. And, you know, it really starts from a fundamental belief that we are all beautiful beings and we all are capable of improvement. We are all capable of some level of accountability when properly supported to do that. And so it is really this heart of total partiality towards all people all the time, as much as possible, right? So am I perfect at that? Absolutely not, right? Are there times when I feel this feeling of sides popping up in me? Sure. That might be particularly so when it's somebody very close to me who's been harmed, right? I am working on being someone who sort of moves beyond that as well. But, and I think that that relates in some ways to who should be the facilitator of a process, right? If I feel like I'm not capable of equal partiality, then I don't know that I'm going to be the best facilitator for a restorative justice process. So that being said, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't participate in a process where I know the parties well. There are times when I have known the person who's caused the harm and the person who's experienced the harm and known the community and known all the people in the community. And I don't think that that disqualifies me in the same way that in the legal system, you know, we recuse ourselves if we are too close to the issue, either personally or actually knowing the folks. And particularly my Navajo teachers have said that that's literally the opposite of the way they would do things, that no one would be qualified to hold space if they weren't deeply knowledgeable about the parties, right? The question is equal partiality, not lack of knowledge. Deep knowledge with equal partiality might make for the best facilitator. That's not always possible, especially when we're having restorative justice programs where people don't know people necessarily who, like, there might be a community-based organization where there's restorative justice facilitators on offer. Sometimes when that community-based organization is embedded in the community in which the harm's happening, they will know the people who are involved, and sometimes they won't. But anyway, so this is sort of the standard that we're kind of trying to go for, this equal partiality, not neutrality standard. And so there are many, many ways in which this can happen. At Impact Justice, we work particularly with two models, circle process and circles and restorative community conferencing. And so circles can take many, many different, there's so many different forms. We learned from Kay Pranis, I learned from Kay Pranis, and many of the people at Impact Justice come from other organizations where the original line of sort of information came from Kay Pranis, who learned from the people of the Yukon as well as from Plains Indians, and sort of was given permission by many Indigenous people that she learned from to share what she had been taught and to actually alter things in some ways in order to be beneficial to communities that are not embedded in Indigenous values, right? And so she's done an excellent job of creating the circle process that has exercises where we can help create, for the purpose of this circle, for the purpose of this community, for as long as it's going to last together, a set of shared values that we're going to operate in relationship to. That I find very interesting and lots to learn from there, peacemaking circles from various Indigenous communities. And the other model we work in is restorative community conferencing, which comes from Aotearoa, from the Maori folks, the family group conferencing model that they use there. was secularized to some degree by the New Zealand government and made the way in which all youth wrongdoing is addressed as a matter of course. Restorative justice through family group conferencing is the way in which youthful wrongdoing is addressed. And my team at Impact Justice is doing an amazing job rolling out community approaches to addressing youthful wrongdoing, particularly felonies and other types of harm, through restorative community conferencing. But I think that it's also a model that we should be thinking about in relationship to intimate partner and sexual violence. We are just at the beginnings of starting to explore how we might do that in a good and a safe way. I think that the major difference that I would state now in relationship to the work that I am starting to get involved in Richmond, California, and in other places around restorative approaches to intimate partner and sexual violence is that the standard sort of diversion model may not be ideal. We know that 50% of survivors don't contact the system at all. And of those who do, 20% say it made them less safe. I got that information from B. Hansen when I was at a roundtable for restorative justice in New Mexico about like 8 years ago. So this is outdated data, I'm not sure. After all that we know that's been going on with ICE and continued increased fear of contacting the system, that those numbers may be worse. They may be better, it's hard to know. That was information that you could get from the federal government under the last administration, but not under this one. So I think it's really important to consider that off-the-grid approaches to addressing intimate partner and sexual violence, right? That people shouldn't have to call the police in order to be sent to someone who will tell them the restorative justice is available, but rather that they should be able to walk into community-based organizations from jump and say, I need help. I'm in this relationship where we're experiencing violence, or I need help. My boyfriend sexually assaulted me and I want to have a dialogue with him. I want to figure out how to do this through restorative justice and be able to receive that as a first step, as a first matter of course. So just some stories about what that looks like. And I think I'll just give you sort of the highest levels of what that looks like, right? It's, thinking about teen dating violence, I think one of the things that was most moving to me in the handful of these cases that I got to do was that every young person who caused harm in teen dating violence situations, and some of those were coextensive with sexual violence, said at one point some version of these words, help me not be like my father, right? That all of these young people who are causing sexual harm and particularly teen dating violence were living in a home in which there was, or living in a family in which they grew up observing this. And I think that that's one of the most important takeaways from my experience in those cases. And then I think that it got sent out in events. I think Chelsea sent out this article in Vox 2018. I wrote a piece called, and Chelsea has just put it in the chat thing. It's a piece where I tell a story about a case that I facilitated in the sexual harm context. So I think several of you have probably read that at this point. And that was a really, really powerful case. And again, I'm just trying to be mindful of time. And so I'm going to let folks read that in their own time. And I really think that I told the story there in a very thorough way. My big takeaways from that case in particular was the power of watching a young woman say, it was a 9th grader who was sexually assaulted by a 12th grader who she had been friends with. And there was some potential, not sure exactly what the extent of their connection was prior to this, but he did ultimately sexually assault her. And she initially didn't want to, she initially was nervous about being in the room, but then changed her mind and wanted to be there, but decided she wanted her mother to be the person who communicated directly about the harm that she experienced. And she'd sort of written it all out, and we'd done a lot of prep work to prepare her for being in the discussion. And when she saw his face in the circle, she sort of took over and really told him a thing or two about what no means no means, and really wanted to get to the roots of where his behavior came from. And it was the most powerful conversation I have ever witnessed about the roots of sexual harm and the roots in his own life and in his own miseducation about about gender and sexuality, and about what it takes for people to make it right, and what was really desired by the person who experienced harm, and what it meant for her to be supported to name it in front of him and in front of her family and his family, and ultimately seeing the women in his family really empathizing with the person that that their son, their brother had harmed, and ultimately working together to move forward in a good way. It was really, really powerful. And I walked away from that particular dialogue conference circle feeling like this, if we can find a way to make this available. When I think about my first meeting with that young man and my first meeting with that young woman that were separate, right? They're separate. There's significant amounts of preparatory work on both sides. And myself and my co-facilitator were meeting with both separately. And then ultimately we all came together. And when I think about the transformation that happened through those preparatory sessions, and then, but the real power came from the time that we were in the circle together, where everyone had been prepped and everyone knew, that they were going to be held by us to be able to have the conversation that they need to have. I walked away with a true belief that this is a way that we could handle some pretty serious cases of sexual harm. So just really briefly, I want to mention that there's been quite a bit of historical opposition to using restorative justice with intimate partner and sexual violence. And I think that it's important to name the fears and to hold the legitimacy of those fears, right? So people have expressed these kinds of fears, that survivors, I should say, will lack agency and safety in restorative processes, right? And I have seen restorative justice programs and processes who have not taken, who have pressured survivors to participate, who have an orientation towards folks who've caused harm without having enough knowledge about the underlying impact of sexual violence, about just wanting to see, and I want to understand it and honor it, that we don't want to see people go to prison, et cetera, but at the same time, running with that agenda at the expense of crime survivors. And so I think that it's important to name that this is a fear, right? That if we hold up restorative justice as good and right, then people may be pressured into dialogues, that people may be rushed to a process, particularly if it's operating in tandem with the state, where there's like a deadline by which the thing needs to happen. And so then how do we do that in a way that doesn't risk agency and safety on the part of survivors, right? So I think that these are important fears to name. Another fear has been that restorative justice will return things like intimate partner violence and sexual violence to the private sphere, right? Like there was a ton of work done in the 70s and 80s for people to say, like, this is a thing that actually happens, and you did treat an assault or a harm that happens in a home, or that is something that is, by nature, something that we're afraid to bring out into the open, like sexual violence, that there are consequences for bringing it out, that it has stayed in the private sphere for those reasons. And so making things a crime was a part of how it got acknowledged sort of in the national public consciousness. And so I get that. And I think it's really important for us to remember that restorative justice is not private. It is not, it should be confidential, right? But it shouldn't be it shouldn't be returning things to a place of secrecy. That is so important to name. That actually having family and community have a very, in the circle itself, a very open dialogue is actually bringing things out of secrecies and shadow that usually accompany these harms. So restorative justice, the last fear is that restorative justice will undermine certain feminist theories on the causes of violence against women. And so I remember when I first got involved in restorative justice, in work to end intimate partner and sexual violence. And I was told very clearly that men abuse because they can. And this was the trainings that I received over and over. And I know we've made some headway since then, right? That it's not that simple. And that the patriarchy means that men are abusive, really was some stuff that we were saying in a pretty intense and rigid way in the late 80s and early 90s, right? But I think that this notion that people can and will change is something that was really lacking at the inception of our work. And it is something that, like, even batter's intervention programs were seen as, like, futile, because they were expecting something that was impossible. But then that problem was solved by telling people who go to these kinds of programs to unlearn the patriarchy, that if you're told you do this because you can, and that this is inherent to your being, that you will cause sexual harm, that you will cause intimate partner violence, that you will do these things because that's when you have to just like fight your inner nature as a person of your gender. I don't really think that that's going to get us across the finish line in terms of a world in which we are free of these kinds of harms, right? I fundamentally don't believe that. So I don't believe that about any of the men that I have ever met, including people who are locked up for the rest of their lives for having done unthinkable levels of sexual violence. I believe that there is a possibility for change in all of us. So so I just need to name some of those fears that I think people express. There might be a million more. And I think we need to attend to them, right? Like it's not like we jump on the restorative justice bandwagon and then all of a sudden all of these things aren't true. They may be true, or they may be partially true. And how do we name them, excavate them, and attend to them feels very, very important. So let's see, next slide. When we are thinking about restorative justice in our communities and bringing them to our communities, the most important thing is to start, particularly in relationship to sexual violence, but in all harms that occur, but in sexual violence and intimate partner violence, we really need to be centering survivor agency and safety. We have to remember that restorative justice isn't mediation. Remember the 3 questions, right? Who was harmed and what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? When I think about traditional mediation models where we've got sort of 2 sides and we're trying to figure out how to bring everybody together in the middle, this is not about bringing people together in the middle. I don't want to be brought to the middle about some shared narrative that we can both have, in which the people who've raped me, you know, I get to like soften what I'm saying so that I'm making people comfortable. No, we're not doing any of that, right? That's not what it's about. So I'm defining the harm, and I need the way in which I've defined the harm to be held and to be understood, for people to use my language in relationship to how I talk about the harms that I've experienced, et cetera. There are things that I've lived through that I call rape. There are things that I lived through that I call sexual assault. I need us to attend to that in the way in which I'm defining it, right? This isn't about us coming to some compromise understanding of what it is that I've experienced. And then, you know, naming that, yeah, my needs, the victim identified needs, the crime survivor identified needs are put at the center of restorative processes. And one of the most critical things, a shift that I had to make as a former advocate and as a former lawyer, is that we have to trust more than we do today that survivors know what will make them safe. And that people who are close to the survivor are going to be knowing way more than I do, right? Before I used to come with sort of like these things on offer. You get an order of protection and you can go to this program or that program, or you can, like, these are the things, we're going to relocate you, or this or that, the other. And I sort of would have my little list of things that I would do. And I would sort of bring my models and apply them to people. And when I came to restorative justice, it was actually quite a huge relief for me to not have to have answers to other people's situations that I actually didn't know as much about as they did, right? So I think that that's really important to name that we have to trust that people know what they need. It doesn't mean that we support stuff that seems like incredibly deadly dangerous, right? We don't do whatever anyone says as restorative justice facilitators, but we do have to deeply, deeply listen to other people's notions of what safety, agency, healing, accountability look like for them. That's what's really beautiful about these processes. And that in that, you know, the self and chosen supporters are quote unquote enforcers, not necessarily the state, ideally not the state at all, is the way I approach the work. And so that's another thing that I think is really important. That in and of itself, when you are being given a notion of accountability that is how long somebody else is going to be locked up, or what other state process is going to be done to the person that hurts you, that's not really centering or what it is that it doesn't give me any agency as being a part of the process that is rebalancing the imbalance that happened when a harm got caused, right? So that feels important. When I say enforcers, I don't at all mean vigilantism, right? These restorative justice processes are ones that happen in deep dialogue, and again, really holding the humanity of everyone involved. This word in Maori, mana, I think best describes this idea. It's sort of your dignity and your life force and your status in the community and your sort of well-being in the community, this word mana. And I was told, I believe it was by Edie Mako, as a restorative justice facilitator in Aotearoa, a Maori woman, said that the purpose of a restorative justice process is for every single person to walk out with their dignity maintained or intact or increased. So when you're leaning into that everyone's dignity is intact or increased, if that's what we're being enforcers of, in a sense, it really takes sort of that negativity out of that word enforcer. Like, yeah, I do kind of want to help really hold that process. So, and last, on this sort of set of questions is that, again, community-based doesn't mean private, right? It doesn't, restorative justice won't work without community. I often use that like social work tool of concentric spheres, like who are your closest people, and then who are the next level of people out, and then who are other people in your life who might be benefit, and really getting as many of the people who, through dialogue with the people who are directly impacted, involved in that decision-making about who should be coming into the circle. That's a huge part of what makes restorative justice effective, is to have those family and community members there. It's really important that facilitators, particularly in sexual violence cases, meet with every single person who's going to be in the circle or the conference in advance, so we have a heads up about where people are coming from, and to really be able to make sure that there's nobody coming that's not going to be coming from a place of wanting everyone's mana to be intact or increased, or wanting everyone to move forward in a good way. VOD models, victim offender dialogue models, while I see them as being really beneficial inside prison, I don't think that they have enough people in the room. It's often just like two people in a dialogue, literally, about a thing that happened many, many ages ago, and that model isn't necessarily enough people in ongoing relationships. Sometimes there's supporters in the room, but it's not really the model that I would suggest for sexual violence cases. Those mediation and dialogue models, rather circle, conferencing, other models that are really about bringing family and community in to be the holders of the space. Again, avoiding third-party decider models, which to my mind aren't really restorative justice. So a lot of people say we have a youth court and it's restorative justice, or we have like a community board and that's restorative. If there's somebody other than the survivor that is like the central person in the consensus-based process, helping determine what the outcome of this thing is, when there's a plan to repair the harm and move forward in a good way, if there's some other person deciding, for me as a survivor of sexual violence, once again, it's like somebody else deciding about my body, what happened, somebody deciding about my history, about my suffering, that doesn't feel right to me. So, so I would just really think about that. Hang on, just checking the chat here. Oh, I'm seeing questions coming up and I will get to those. How can restorative justice be used for youth who don't have a memory of the sexual violence? I'm going to put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to these questions as I'm seeing a couple questions starting to pop in. Okay, so thank you for your questions, and I will be getting to them shortly. So let me make sure I can scroll back. Yes, I can. Okay, so finally, for me, again, coming from my personal history, increased safety for survivors who are unwilling to engage state actors is really important, right? I mean, for me, I could have really used something that addressed the harm. And a very brief story from my own childhood. I left home briefly and stayed with a teacher at one point who brought me back home. And when people ask, like, what's your first experience with restorative justice? I'm like, actually, I was 14 and I left home. And then my teacher brought me back and we all sat sort of in a circle and answered this question, which was, why do we think Sujatha is leaving home? And it was through that, while the truth didn't come out, my father was in that circle, my mother was in that circle, right? And while the full truth didn't come out, when I looked at my father right in the eyes during that dialogue and I said, I don't know, Anu, I called him Anu. I don't know, Anu, why don't you tell us, why do you think I don't want to be here? And I saw fear on his face for the first time. And after that circle, you know, it wasn't the way we would do circle today, right? He never touched me again. And so I think that this is, so for me, that there was something that didn't involve calling the system was very, very important for me. So I am going to pop up in here and see if there's more. There is more Q&A happening. And I'm gonna close out this really quickly. I would just suggest, and then I'm going to move to the questions because they're starting to pour in. Okay, which tells me I've talked enough and it's time to chat with all of you.
That sounds great.
Yeah, okay. So I would check out this report called A Reasoned Approach, Reshaping Sex Offender Policy to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse. It's outdated 2011, but it really shows the failures of the current criminal legal system's approach to ending sexual violence. And I'm going to just run through these super fast, which is the standards by which we approach sexual violence, right? It's got to be voluntary. I would suggest starting your program by doing focus groups and using Circle as focus groups for asking survivors what they'd like their restorative justice program to look like in your area. It's going to take a lot more than just 40 hours of training in restorative justice and 40 hours of training in this and that and the other. That I think that it's going to have to be born out of the wisdom, both of folks who caused harm and experienced harm, the way we start to build this work. Again, it's not about neutral peace. It's not about neutrality. It's about people who are really moving forward in a good way. I think that there's some wisdom about safety planning that we can be thinking about in terms of people who are in stalking and other sort of longer term sexual violence situations. My great hope is that this not become something that's like professionalized or certified in a way, because I think that that really limits community capacity to intervene. And I think that some of the best, I think I literally have to take off my lawyer hat and my advocate hat a lot of the time to do my best work as a restorative justice facilitator. And so this uber professionalization of restorative justice will take it very far from its roots and its best work. That's my personal feeling. If we're being very, very, if we're increasing our discretion about what we'll consider for a restorative justice process, then I think it's going to lead to discrimination in certain communities. We've seen that in all kinds of programs we create. And so I would strongly suggest letting be whatever I need. And I say what else because I think the answers are going to come from people who try to do this work. With that, I'll just close out with this quote, which is that reconciliation does not mean forgetting or trying to bury the pain of conflict, but that reconciliation means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. And so I think we have some work to do, not just in restorative justice more broadly, but in the field and the history of the field itself, like who got pushed out of our movements to end sexual and intimate partner violence. My hope is that we might have a compassion and accountability and truth and reconciliation process inside our movement work, also as a piece of the work to do. So with
Okay, thank you, folks. I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. In just a moment. We're experiencing a storm here, so I'm having a couple of tech difficulties, but we're getting there. So now that we've, listened to Sujatha, and perhaps by now, for those of you who have not read the Vokes article, you may have taken a look at that so far. So we're going to enter into our facilitated discussion portion of today's webinar. And our first question is, did you hear or read anything new or surprising in the recording or in the article that we'd shared? And please feel free to enter that into the chat. Alyssa, would you mind sharing anything that's popping up in the chat? I'm having trouble getting to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had Matthew had said before today I'd never heard of restorative justice. So like that's awesome that we were able to talk about that with you today.
Yeah.
That's great. And let's see. There is a long multicultural history of restorative justice practices.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The concept of equal partiality, I believe it is called, was completely new to me.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was new to me too.
Yeah.
Is anything else, striking to folks? And if you have questions related to content or restorative justice, feel free to add questions into the Q&A box too. So for those of you for whom this was maybe not totally new, what has been your experience with restorative justice or RJ?
Someone else had said that they like that the victim gets to decide what they need for healing to move forward. It's not the court system, and that the victim is heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh, I might lose power, folks.
Yeah, I just looked outside too, and it doesn't look too great here in
Yeah.
Roy.
So if you lose me, I'll try to get back in, but
Wow.
so another kind of question that we've been thinking about is, related to some of what folks have shared already. What are some possibilities that restorative justice might offer? And what remaining concerns do you have? Feel free to share in the chat and pop your questions in the Q&A too. I'm looking in the chat.
Chel, you want me to read some messages in the chat?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
All right. So let's see. We have that restorative justice feels safe and healing coming from someone with oppressive experiences with law enforcement. Absolutely. One question we have is how long after the sexual assault do people start this process?
That's a really good question. I'm going to note that and try to reach out to Sujatha. She's facilitated a lot of these processes, and I think she would know a lot better. But ultimately, it seems that it would be up to the survivor to decide, when they're ready, when they want to. One thing that I've learned from not just learning about restorative justice processes, but other processes like community accountability, is that they're really difficult. So it may take time for someone to want to engage in the process, which is very similar to how many survivors, might interact with the criminal legal system. For many of us, it takes time. Yeah, my power is flickering. I'm also seeing a question How do you respond to concerns that people who caused harm will reoffend, in quotes, after a restorative justice dialogue? And I definitely welcome folks who also have thoughts on this, but my first thought is that people are more likely to, quote, reoffend if they've been funneled through the criminal justice system than they would be through a restorative justice dialogue. And we've got in the chat, someone recommends checking out a Journey of Healing podcast for more firsthand accounts of going through these processes. Thank you, that's really helpful. I am looking through the chat. Thank you all so much for this feedback. So there's a question about doing restorative justice with sexual violence is how do you get folks who have caused harm to participate on their own in the restorative justice processes that this commenter has had experience with. Offenders or people who do harm participate because the other option they're given is the criminal justice system. And that's a really, really good question. One of the things that I've learned about these processes is they have to be voluntary in order for them to work or to be restorative. It seems that in your case, or in the case you experienced or witnessed, they really didn't have a choice. And yeah, that's really difficult. I'm seeing also comments, so many survivors want a way to tell their story and be heard and seen by the people who've harmed them, as well as give back and support other survivors. There's another comment. I think there's still a big societal understanding that admitting to harm means signing up for punishment in return. And that is huge. One of the things I've learned from Miriam Kaba specifically is that, the systems that we have set up don't encourage honesty. They don't encourage us to own up to harm that we've done. Instead, we're put in an adversarial position and we're really just encouraged to defend ourselves from it. I'm seeing also a comment. Someone's glad that we're having these conversations and acknowledging that justice looks different to each survivor. That's true. Welcome back, Alyssa. Let's see. Oh, hey there, Chris.
Hey, hi, Chel. I just wanted to share something, and rather than try to type it, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember working with a friend who was raped a few years ago locally, and they asked me for a referral for an advocate to help them through a reporting process. And it turned out that there really wasn't an advocate really available at that time, that they wanted to talk to someone. So I went with them to the police, and the police officer was really sensitive to, it was someone who we had actually brought in for training once. So that was really great that it was someone NYSCASA had familiarity with, being culturally sensitive and aware of trauma. And so they were really good at listening to my friend talk about what happened. And also, like, my friend expressed the desire to not really go after like prison or set, like some kind of punishment. They asked for a way to hold this person accountable in a way that it made them like understand that what they'd done was violent and what they'd done was painful and wrong and unwanted. Because, you know, in my friend's circumstance, they'd gone numb and they hadn't like known how to resist. They were so shocked. It happened in their own home, and they, you know, it just caught them in a place of vulnerability where they lost their power. And that's such a frequent response for survivors. And it was really great that the police officer understood that, and the police officer didn't pressure the person to do anything that other than what the person wanted, what my friend wanted to do. Like my friend really felt like they didn't want to see this person get incarcerated, and because they knew that it wouldn't go well for that person as a Black person in particular. And this friend of mine was white, and she just felt like this was like going to be a situation where she did not want to follow that historical like trajectory of being another white victim of someone who didn't even seem like, she didn't think he understood that what he'd done was violence. That's what she wanted to get across to him, that this was violence, that this was a form of violence, and it was an unwanted act. And, you know, it's sad because we didn't have an apparatus here to make that happen. We did not have a circle process to offer. But it was important that she was able to express that. And then we did do a ritual to keep her home, to reclaim her home as a sanctuary of safety. And that was restorative in a different way. I never found out like what happened. She wasn't a super close friend, so I never found out anything that might have happened down the road with an accountability process. But we lack these circles of restorative practice in our communities, even when we do have good advocates and relationships with law enforcement. And it's something that I feel like we're in the infancy of developing. So I wanted to share that because I don't think that that's uncommon. I think that that is a very typical victim-survivor response.
Yeah, and that really resonates with me, like in my own experiences of
I know there's a storm, Chel, and you just froze, so I don't know if that's just on my computer or for everyone. But the storm's passing through, and hopefully we'll see you and hear you again. Alyssa, are you still there?
I'm half frozen too. I just lost power and Wi-Fi going
Okay.
in and out.
Yeah, it looks like I am now the host since we lost Chel. Well, I'm glad that I can be here with you and support. Hopefully Chel will be able to rejoin us in a moment. I think it's important to share some of these other comments that were made and questions asked. So somebody asked about how it may work with elder abuse. And I know tomorrow we're having a webinar on elder abuse that Josie McPherson's going to be facilitating. So I encourage whoever that questioner was or commenter was to check out the webinar tomorrow afternoon. I believe it's in the afternoon. I'll double check the time and maybe someone can put that in the chat. It's actually at 11 a.m. tomorrow. And then someone else said, I've studied it in my criminal justice education, wrote a paper about the use of it in sexual assault cases. No firsthand experience, though. I appreciate it gives alternate solutions to what is clearly a dysfunctional and often hard to navigate criminal justice system. Yeah, indeed, a very hard to navigate system. And I echo your thought on it being dysfunctional. August said, I've seen effective and also horrible attempts at restorative justice for sexual violence in a community setting. And now I'm trying to learn from those and get an organized system and support set up in our rural area. Well, that's great, because we do need these systems to be set up. And I think they're, as I said a moment ago, they're lacking not just in rural areas, but even in the more larger townships and cities. I do have concerns that with RJ, actual legal enforcement against perpetrators might not happen. So yes, Matthew, I hear that you have concerns that actual legal enforcement against perpetrators might not happen.
Sorry.
Good to have you back, Chel.
Yeah,
Yeah, the storm's pretty bad here.
yeah, the storm's pretty intense. One of the things that I keep coming back to is under our current legal system, you know, people are not being held accountable by the legal system. Many of us know, you know, rape and sexual abuse are underreported. People aren't reporting to law enforcement. People are starting to report more, but it's overwhelmingly underreported and it's overwhelmingly under-prosecuted for various reasons. So that's something that I'm struggling with too, is our current system, under our current system, people who do harm are not facing consequences as well.
NYSCASA did a whole visual action to show the low levels of reporting, the low levels of investigation, and the low levels of actual indictments and prosecutions, and the one conviction per 100 cases that does come forward. We did this before we started to really dive more deeply into transformative justice work, because we recognized how poorly met survivors' cries were, survivors' stories, survivors' accounts were not being heeded. And that's what led us to this place where we are now. It's like the fact that, like you just said, Chel, like it's not like the system is serving people in the way. And also many survivors want accountability, but they don't necessarily want a legal enforcement around that. They don't necessarily want to involve a punitive or paternalistic system. Particularly if they've had negative experiences with law enforcement themselves, it's not going to be where they go, and it's not going to be effective for them. So, although I hear that concern and I know what that comes from, and it's like, I agree with you that our current system's failing us.
Yeah, Tana shared a couple of comments in the chat that also really resonate. You know, that there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. That really is one of the issues with our current legal system, is the desire to apply a one-size-fits-all solution to situations that are complex and varied, and that don't, you know, applying solutions that don't meet the expressed needs and wants of survivors maybe doesn't work. many of the restorative processes that are happening are really happening at a local level, not at like a state or a federal level. So we really don't know what a system at that scale would look like. And in some of the experiences of folks that I've learned from, like Miriam Kaba, these things shouldn't be enacted on large scales like that, and may not be appropriate for all communities. And one of the other things that we had mentioned earlier is restorative justice processes might not be appropriate for all situations.
That's right. It sounds like there's some other resources that were also offered here. If we back up, in case, I don't know if everybody's able to access the chat. I saw also the question about doing RJ with sexual violence is getting folks who have caused harm to participate on their own. The RJ I've had experience with, offenders participate because the other option they are given is the punitive criminal justice system. Yeah, that's definitely a valid, real concern, because if people are only doing it to stay out of jail and they're not seeing their own actions as harmful, or they're not able to hold themselves accountable, how, you know, what kind of supports are there to make sure that their participation in a circle is genuine and not going to do more harm. That's where there's got to be some preparatory work done, often before any kind of real circle process occurs with the survivor present. It's like Chel said, it's not always appropriate. Sometimes RJ is not a good fit for people. And there was somebody mentioned, I'm trying to find where it was offered. Recording link, I think it was. Oh, check out, Tana also said, check out A Journey of Healing podcast for more firsthand accounts of going through this type of process. So for those of you who don't see the chat, you might want to jot down the podcast, A Journey of Healing. You pick up more firsthand accounts of an RJ process. Yeah, and I appreciate the comment from a survivor saying that they are trying to become more receptive to the idea of restorative justice, and they feel that the dynamics of sexual violence make it difficult. Definitely appreciate that.
And that also shows just how varied, you know, survivors' wants and needs are. And, you know, I'm speaking as a survivor too. We're not a homogenous group that wants the same thing. So it's so important to recognize that.
There's so many dynamics in terms of like who harmed you and how it happened and what state of mind are you in when, what are your resources and how else can you get help? You know, it's a whole list of things that have to be considered.
Yeah, there's a question here about what would consequences look like under a restorative justice system. And that really varies. So there are restorative justice diversion programs that are in collaboration with the courts and the law enforcement systems. And those focus on diverting people away from jail and prison. And look like very different things. In a restorative justice process, it really could be, it's really focused on what the survivor identifies would be appropriate. Maybe it's, you know, I want them to never work with kids again. I want them to resign from their job. It's it could be a consequence that maybe isn't, punishment through incarceration. Another thought I'm having is, are we talking about consequences or are we talking about punishment? Because those are also very different.
And then there's the whole community piece, right? And I know that restorative justice came out of a circle process that was Indigenous, and that Indigenous communities did not have the option to ever hand people over. That was not an option for them. They were trying so hard to keep their communities intact. And if they had handed over everyone who had harmed anyone, there would be no one left virtually, because there was a lot of harm being generated through trauma that had been experienced, and trauma begets trauma, and so it was absolutely necessary for the community to hold people accountable for doing being healthy around children, as you mentioned, or not being allowed to see their own children, or being only allowed to see their own children when others were around to protect the children. There was a whole range of ways in which the community would virtually be vigilant around the person who'd done harm, and without shunning them and banishing them, maintain their connection to community, but an uncomfortable period of transition during which they had to prove they wanted to be in community. They had to prove that they were still willing, to be a community member and hold their hearts, open in a way to heal what was hurting their heart, because it's often that old trauma that begets more trauma. And unless they wanted to do the work and were willing to do the work on their own healing process, they were never going to be a safe person in their community for others. And that's not an easy lift. And a community of people who are already hurting, from various oppressions, that was a huge undertaking. And we have a couple of videos in NYSCASA's library on it. And I know that a couple of them are available for free through Tribal Law Policy, I believe, is one of the places. And I'm trying to remember the titles of the VHSs that I know are available online now. I'll get back to that. Oh, Hollow Water is one of them. Hollow Water is one of the ones you can look up online. Talks more about that. It's a community in Canada where a lot of this work began.
Yeah. There's a question here. Is therapy ever offered to the offender? I know better about cases of like community accountability processes, which we'll be learning about in our next webinar. But that's often a requirement, or what a survivor asks of the person who hurt them is to go through therapy or to go through programs like that, or like batterer intervention programs. And that's absolutely an option and can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I saw a question about are there federal grants that are supportive of the creation of local restorative justice options and programs. We sure hope so. We're actually writing pieces of RJ work into some of our proposals that are not federal, but I believe the answer is yes, but I don't know of any to point to.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I haven't seen like federal grants specifically focusing on that, but we'll be keeping our eye out.
Yeah, it's a great question.
So we're getting close to 4:30. So unless folks have additional questions, feel free to share those in the chat or in the Q&A. But I did want to make sure that we have some time to talk about upcoming webinars that NYSCASA is offering. I will put some registration links in the chat for you. Tomorrow, October 8th, we'll be hosting a webinar focusing on elder abuse. On October 21st, we'll be hosting a webinar, much like the one today, on transformative justice approaches to sexual violence with our colleagues at Spring Up. And on October 22nd, Chris will be presenting a webinar on yoga practice as trauma-informed care. So please register and join us. We look forward to having you participating. And Chris, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just feel free to share those with your friends and colleagues. So if you could copy out of the chat to a message to share, that would always be helpful to help us get the word out. We are, although a statewide coalition, there are still a lot of folks that aren't on our list and may not know about what we're doing. So we appreciate your support in getting out the word. And I thank everyone for your participation today.